Welcome to day 2 tutorial. Yesterday we looked at an existing pool harbour model. So the hard work had been done for us. The grid had been built, the friction map had been built, the boundary conditions had been built. And we essentially took those files and set up the model in Pixus, and then very briefly at the end we looked at the results in Blue Canoe. Well, today we're going to work a little bit harder. We're going to mainly focus on Blue Canoe. So I'm just going to click on the link on my desktop that I already created, but as I said before, if you just go to the search there, type in Blue Canoe on the university computers, you will find it. So we're going to spend a bit more time in Blue Canoe doing pre-processing. Blue Canoe is one of the packages that people use to pre-process files for Telemac. So today we're going to build 3 grids. We're going to start really simple and just build a conceptual model of the Solent, just assuming uniform depth with roughly the same dimensions as a Solent. We're going to do that in Blue Canoe and then set up the model like we did yesterday in Pixus, and then come back to Blue Canoe to do our post-processing to look at the results. So yesterday we set up a folder called SOES Practicals on our desktop. What you need to do today is go into Blackboard, go to Course Documents, then Practicals, and go into the Day 2 Conceptual Model of the Solent. Obviously download the PDF which has the steps and open that on one screen. And importantly now is to download this Day 2 zip file. Now I've already done that here, so here's my Day 2 folder. Now remember to unzip it, because on Blackboard here it's a zip file. So just remember to unzip it and extract the folders. So is Practical. In there you should have Day 2. And in here we have 2 folders, one called Forcing. This is our tidal forcing. Like I said before, you can just open this with a WordPad. I'm going to use TextPad here. And you can see that it's got similar columns to as before. We've got sea level 1, sea level 2, and sea level 3, which we'll use to drive our west and east boundaries. We also have a folder called Mesh. We've got an outline of our model domain, a simplified Isle of Wight, which is just a circle, and then we've got some additional ones to create Bramble Bank. So we're going to create 3 models. So to do that we need 3 grids. One is just a simple outline, then we're going to add the Isle of Wight, then we're going to add Bramble Bank Sandbank as well. So as I said before, let's start in Blue Canoe. And the first step we're going to do is open a boundary file. So just click on the open icon here, navigate to your Practicals, Day 2, and we're going to mainly focus on the mesh. Use the drop down here to look at all the files in there. So to start with, let's just load in our outline understroke SW, Southampton Water. And this we can drag to the 2D view, and we can zoom out. And what we're going to do here is just very simply approximate the Solent. So this is the kind of wider region, and this is Southampton. Obviously Southampton tends to comes off at an angle, but we're just going to simplify it. We're going to create a model with just uniform depth, and yeah, it's always good with modelling to start very simple, build a conceptual model first, see what the kind of flow patterns are before you get more complex. Okay, what we're going to do now is generate a mesh generator. So to do that, go to File, New, T3 Mesh Generator. So File, New, T3 Mesh Generator. There. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the default edge length. So this is the kind of length of the size of the triangles that we're going to create. We're going to create a flexible mesh. So we want that as 1500. Leave everything as default, and here we're going to call this mesh no Isle of Wight. And we can click on OK there. Now what we need to do is drag our outline, simplified outline, onto the outline setting there. And that's obviously tells Mesh what we need to generate. So double click on the Mesh generator again, and this time we can just select Run. This will tell us some statistics. Press OK, and our mesh has now been generated. And you can see we have a new mesh there. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag that new mesh onto the 2D view. Close this down, and you can see that our mesh has been generated there. We can go back in here and change some of the settings, but to start with, let's just leave it like that. So you can see how easy it is. We have a mesh generated, our first mesh generated of the conceptual model with no Isle of Wight. Now, once we've got a mesh, we need to interpolate some bathymetry onto it. And we're going to keep it really simple and just give it a uniform depth. As you'll see tomorrow, we'll load in an actual bathymetry. Now to do that, what we need to do here is click on this new closed line. And we're going to create a polygon that just encircles this whole mesh. So we just need to create 4 points that encircle the whole mesh there. And then what we're going to do is just click on the clothesline again to create that. And what I'm going to do is just call this bathy. And we need to give it a value, so we're going to give it a value of -15 meters. So we're going to assume that there's a uniform depth of approximately 15 meters. The units are meters there, okay? And we can click OK. So that's our bathy outline there. Now what we need to do now is get that bathy onto the mesh. To do that, we go to File, New, and we generate a new 2D interpolator. File, New, 2D interpolator. And that's the 2D interpolator there. And what we need to do is drag this bathy onto the interpolator. So I just drag the bathy onto the interpolator there. As we get further, it's always good to name each of these, name the mesh, name the interpolator as something simple, particularly if you have multiple meshes open like we will do on day 3. But today we're just going to leave it as default. Now what we need to do is interpolate this onto the mesh. So this is very important, make sure you do this. Select the new mesh that we have generated and go Tools, Map Object. And what you want to map is that new 2D interpolator. So I'll do that again just to show you. Make sure you select the mesh, Tools, Map Object, and select the 2D interpolator there. Press OK. Now this is very important because Telemac wants this to be called bottom. So this is a sort of bottom bathymetry, so make sure you call it bottom in all capitals and give it the units of meters and press OK. And what you can see hopefully is that's changed colour now. And if you click on any node, make sure you do this, it's really important that it's got the -15. So if it doesn't have -15, you've done it incorrectly. Okay, so now we have a mesh and we've interpolated our bathymetry onto it. What's the final step now is we need to create a mesh file that Telemac will recognize. And to do that we go File, New, and Telemac looks for what's called a cellophane object. So we need to create a new cellophane object. Again, it's good to name these. So if you double click on it or right click on it, give it a name here. And what we're going to do is we're going to call it Mesh No Isle of Wight. Click Apply. And what we need to do is drag our new mesh onto that. So that's our new mesh. So we just dragged our new mesh onto that. If you double click on this mesh, either double click or right click and go to Properties, we're going to go to Metadata. And again, this is very important, but Telemac wants that to be called bottom. So if you click Apply, so I've named it Mesh No Isle of Wight, my cellophane object, and bottom. Now, if you click Save, this will create the actual cellophane SOES6011 file. And what I suggest is you save this to your day 2 folder. I would save everything there just so that these two are always your original ones with the information that's come, everything you create here. So save it to there. And essentially that is the mesh file now that we are going to use to set up Pixis in stage 1. It's also good practice to always save the workspace. So save the workspace, again save it to day 2. I'm going to call the workspace day 2. And it will ask you for to save the other things. Again, I'm just going to use all of the default names. So this is the mesh you just created. That's the raw mesh file. This is the bathymetry polygon we created, and that's the new 2D interpolator. And the bottom file as well. So that's everything we've created. Okay, so here's our mesh, and that's what we need for stage 1. So what we need to do now is leave this open, because we'll come back to it in a minute. But what we need to do is now open Pixus again. And as long as everything's saved in the same place as before, we can open the workshop workspace that we started yesterday. So go to Workspace, Open, and select the SOES Practicals folder on your desktop. This will take a minute like it did yesterday, but we'll open that up, and it should contain our pool harbour model that we set up yesterday. And again, one of the reasons Pixels has been created, as I said before, is to store all your models, but do it in a systematic way that you can come back at even in several years' time and see exactly what settings you used, what workflows you used, etc. So we'll just wait until that loads up. And the way we're going to set up Pixus is very similar to the way we set it up yesterday. So the steps are very similar, so we can go through this quite quickly. And we're going to do this 3 times today. So this is the first time with no Isle of Wight. Okay, you can see it's starting to load in the information. Okay, so click on Workflows, and this was the model we built yesterday. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the Telemac 2D, and I'm going to rename it. We probably should have done this yesterday. I'm going to call this Pool Harbour, just so we know that's distinguished. Go back to the workflows. So here we'll follow exactly the same steps we did yesterday. Click on Add, Workflow, and we're going to go into the Workflow folder and select the Telemac 2 workflow. So again, we'll set up a 2D conceptual model. Okay, and get into the practice of doing, but let's right click on this, go rename. Let's call this Conceptual. Let's call it Conceptual Solent. Okay, this is our first run. Okay, so like I said yesterday, the first step is to actually load in the mesh that we've just created. So go select the cellophane source on the left, go Add Cellophane Layer. Go to your SOES Practical folder, day 2, and click All Files, and we should see the cellophane mesh that we created. Mesh no Isle of Wight.slf, and we can open that. Leave the default as parameter points, and click OK. Now here we need to give it a projection, and we're going to use a slightly different projection from the Pool Harbour one, and we're going to use this for today and tomorrow. So click on the user selected transform, the 3 dots button, and what we're going to do here is use UTM WGS 1984, and we're going to use 30 north. So if you go down to UTM zone 30 north there. Click apply, OK, and OK again, and this will load in our model. Okay, so now we need to give it set up the 2 boundaries. So like we did yesterday, select that there, click on the first point, click on the last point, go edit boundary, add boundary, and we're going to give it an imposed elevation like we did yesterday. Okay, now I'll just go back here and set up the other one. Deselect all points first to deselect the ones you select here. Click on again, start at the top. Oh, I've selected 2 points, so I'm just going to deselect them. Select selected 2 points again. I might just have to zoom in. So zoom in, deselect, select the first point, select the path, go edit boundary. Again, we'll put in posed elevation because we're going to drive it with tidal levels. So let's click on the first boundary I created, and very similar to yesterday, we're going to use the same steps. So leave that as uniform. We're going to get this from a file. Let's just enlarge this window a little bit. Click on the file name, and this time make sure you're in the day 2. We're going to use the forcing understroke slant water understroke day 2 liquid boundary file. Okay, and we're going to set this up as the sea level 1. So that's our first boundary set up. Go to the second boundary. Again, we'll select that same file, but this time we're going to use 2 points and interpolate between the rest. So that's sea level 2. Set this one up as interpolated. Select the file again and choose sea level 3. 0 means the northernmost boundary, depending on which order you click the points. 1 is the southern. So we're just going to interpolate linearly along the boundary between those 2 points. Okay, so that's your boundary. Get into the habit of regularly saving the workspace. Now it's the model runtime. We're going to use slightly different settings from before, but the best thing to do is go back into your day 2 forcing file and have a look at this in TextPad. In fact, I think we have it open. And here we're going to actually start it from the 1st of January 2010 at 12 o'clock. And you can see that it's on the left boundary, it's about 0 here for our initial conditions. Okay, so 01/01/2010, start at 12 o'clock. Again, if you put any of this in outside of the time step, it would give you an error when you tried to validate it. In terms of the time step today, we're going to go for a slightly bigger time step, which is 30 seconds. Okay, and we're going to run this for 5 days. So that's 14,400 time steps. So there's 2 time steps in a minute. 2 times 60 times 24 hours times 5 days is 14400. Okay. So that's our time step set up. Initial conditions we're going to leave as 0. We're going to go on to the physical parameters now, and we are going to we will leave those all as the default. So leave those at the default now. Go to numeric parameters. We don't actually need to include tidal flats for this one because we've just got negative 15 meters. Go to the results output. Again, we will leave these as the default. In terms of the running log time here, we've got every 30 seconds. We want, so that's 2 a minute. And again, we probably want every 15 minutes. So 2 times 50 is 30. So we can set these up as 30. Okay, let's save that again. Come back to the build and run. We need to give it a caption. So I'm going to put Conceptual Solent. Conceptual Solent. Okay, so hopefully now we've got everything ready. So let's run and validate that and check that there's no errors. Representative latitude. So I've actually forgotten to put in a representative latitude. So if we go back to physical parameters, go to the Coriolis here. Our representative latitude is very similar to what it was yesterday. We just have a look for that. It's about 50.68. It's very similar to what it was yesterday. In fact, I'll just leave it the same. Go back to build and run, click on where it says save, run, validate that again, and hopefully this time we have no errors. So we have no errors this time, which is good. Okay, so now we go to run locally. This might take a little bit longer than it did yesterday, just because we're running it for 5 days, but again, actually it probably take quicker just because our model is so simple. So you can see it's processing there. Like I said yesterday, you can click on the refresh and see what time step it has got to. So we've got to 500 and we've got to do 14,000 time step. So that's actually complete now. It should have done all of our time steps. Okay, so we can go back to the practical folder, look in runs, we should see Conceptual Solent, and we can see a results file there. So everything has run correctly. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new Blue Canoe, just because I'll keep that one for the mesh setup. We can go to Open. This time go to your runs, Conceptual Solent, and look at the res file there. Click OK. Like we did yesterday, drag the velocity and UV to the 2D view, right click on it, go animate, and we can have a look at the results file here. So you can see that our flow's coming in, pretty much traveling to an east and west direction. Probably got a bit of instability there at the boundary, but you can see how the flow comes in to Southampton Water, and you get various sort of patterns there. Okay, so we've successfully run our first model. We can go back to the beginning. Get back to the beginning again now. Okay, so now in terms of stage 2, let's go back to Blue Canoe now. And what we want to do is now set up a new model, but this time with the Isle of Wight. Okay, so we'll go. So here we had mesh, no Isle of Wight. What I'm going to do is go to File, New Mesh Generator. So generate a new mesh generator. Set up the settings the same as before, 1500. Let's call this. What did we call the last one? Let's call this one Mesh Isle of Wight. Click Apply. This time, like we did last time, drag the outline to the outline. But this time we're going to load in this time we're going to load in the Isle of Wight. So go to Solent Practicals, Day 2 Mesh, and we're going to load in the simplified Isle of Wight outline. Now what I'm going to do is create a new 2D view, drag the outline onto that, and this time I'm also going to drag the simplified Isle of Wight. So you can see the simplified Isle of Wight there, a circle. And what we can do is get that simplified Isle of Wight and drag it to soft lines, which is there. Okay. And what we can do is run that. Now that we've done that, we can run it. Select yes. Click OK. Okay. There's our mesh. Let's drag that to the new 2D view, and now you can see we've got a nice grid, but this time with the Isle of Wight. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same bathy outline that I created earlier, because this encompasses that grid as well. So I'm now going to click on my new mesh, go Tools, Map Object, select the 2D interpolator, click OK, make sure you give this the name bottom and meters, click OK. And that has now again put a depth of negative 15 meters on that, which is good. So we need to create a new cellophane object, like we did before. Go File, New Cellophane Object. Make sure you drag the right mesh. This is the mesh with the Isle of Wight. and call this properties, call this mesh Isle of Wight. Okay. Right click on the new mesh under the cellophane object and make sure it's called bottom. Again, this is important because that's what Telemac is looking for. Now what we can do is save that. Save it to the 2 directory as before. So that's our first mesh. This is now our mesh with the Isle of Wight. Now, in terms of recording this video, I'm not going to go through all of the steps again. But like you did last time, click on the workflows, go add, new workflow, select a new Telemac 2D, and set it up in exactly the same way you did before. Right click on it, Conceptual, Solent, and I'll call this 2. So remember, this is the one with the Isle of Wight now. I won't do it as part of this video, but again, create all of the settings as you did before, build the model, run it, look at the results in Blue Canoe. And you should now see slightly different flows. Obviously it won't go all east to west, it will start getting speeded up as it goes through the narrow regions, and it will obviously angle around the Isle of Wight. So in the final step, let's generate a new mesh generator. What we're going to do is we're going to refine the mesh in Bramble Bank, and we're actually going to make a shallower area there. Okay, so let's go to a new mesh generator, file, new mesh generator. Let's call this mesh Isle of Wight and BB on the end for Bramble Banks. Set that up as 1500. Okay. Now what we need to do now, let's do a new 2D view. Drag the outline onto that 2D view. That's the Isle of Wight. Drag the outline. Zoom out. What we're going to do now is we're going to load in 2 additional files. So let's load those in now. Those are in day 2, the mesh folder. There's Bramble Bank. Let's load that in. We can have a quick look at that in the new 2D view. And essentially that's just a circle that maps out the area of Bramble Bank. And it's got a value of -1 meter. So that's what we're going to use to actually create the area within this as being -1. But our grid, if we go back to here, our grid in that area is quite coarse. And ideally we want a higher resolution grid. So we're going to load in this density as well. And we can look at that in the 2D view. And essentially that's an area where we're going to increase the resolution of the grid. So what we can do is get the simplified, click on the simplified, and drag that to outline of our mesh generator. The simplified Isle of Wight goes to the soft lines, and this time the density, which is that circle there, we're going to put into density. And in Day 3 tutorial we'll explore all of these in more detail, but density determines how dense the area. So within that area we're going to have a higher density. And it's actually going to have a density of 800 meters, so the rest of the grid is 1,500, determined by the default edge length, but within that circle it's going to have a value of 800 meters, so there'll be more grid points. So we can click on the mesh generator, run this, select yes, OK, and let's drag that to the new 2D view. So you can see we've got a new mesh, higher resolution in that area. Now, like we did before, we need to use the bathy outline. So what we're going to do is click on our mesh, make sure you've got the right mesh, go Tools, Map Object, and we're going to do, to start with, we're just going to map the interpolator. And this will give it a value of -15 meters. Again, remember to name it bottom. Okay? So this should be 15 meters everywhere. -15 meters, -15 meters. But now what we want to do is select the grid again, and this time we want to map that Bramble Bank where it's going to go down to -1 meter. So go Tools, Map Object, and this time select the Bramble Bank that you loaded in. Make sure you do the bramble bank, not the density one. Click OK. And for the setting here, select no. And what you can see now is that it's minus 15 meters everywhere, but within that bramble bank we specified it's negative 1 meters. So what we can do, like we did before, set up a new cellophane object. You'll become an expert at this by the end of the practical. Drag our new mesh. Again, make sure you get the right new mesh. Give it the name Mesh Isle of Wight Bramble Bank. Click OK. Let's just have an object there. Right click on the mesh, change the keyword to bottom like we did before. Okay, now we can save that and save that in day 2, and now you should see that we have our 3 mesh files. Again, I won't do this, but go into Pixus, add a new workspace, set it up in exactly the same way as you did before, all of the same settings, but this time make sure you remember to click the tidal flats. So let's rename this and call it Conceptual Solent 3. This time, just remember when you go into your numeric parameters, click tidal flats, because now that our bramble bank is at negative 1 meters, it will flood in that area. Again, run that and you can look at how the flows change within that region. Make sure you save this. So that is the end of tutorial 2.